Welcome, everyone. This is The Art of the Ages, and I am your host, Paul Lytle. So, for those who are following this live as we release, you're going to notice that we're a little late. And I'm actually really in love with the podcast medium. I think I've just been completely addicted to podcasts for a very long time. And I've been engaged. I've also been engaged in podcasting for a very long time. I've actually have 3 shows running currently. One of them is on a hiatus, but it will be coming back. And I've had yet another show that it was quite a while ago, and I stopped it after a while. But the funny thing about each and every one of these podcasts, as I've gotten rolling, as I've gotten going on them, when I first started out, in every single case, early on, I have forgotten what day the podcast comes out. And so that's literally what happened this week. And I had Tuesday off, which always throws me off because it always, no matter how like recent the weekend was, if I had the day off, it feels like in my mind that it's Saturday, and I keep expecting like the next day to be Sunday. So I'm not thinking like, hey, tomorrow's Wednesday, I've got to do a podcast episode. That really, in all seriousness, does not cross my mind. So my apologies for those of you who are kind of downloading these live. So this was coming out on Thursday, and it happens to be coming out on Thanksgiving Day, which has always struck me as a particularly Christian holiday, besides the fact that its origins were because of Christianity. But you know, the idea of being thankful, necessitates that there's somebody to be thankful to, that has given you something. And that's kind of what we're continuing this, because so if you were with us last week, and hopefully you were, because we're starting to lay the foundation of why it is we do what we do. And last week we talked about the urge to create being a part of the image of God, that God is a creating God. God is a creator, and having been granted that image of God, that's part of what we desire to do as well. And for more details in it, by all means, download last week's episode, because there's a lot there. But I wanted to dig into a little bit about how God creates. So, the important thing right up front is, like we said last week, we don't create in the same way God creates. God creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. And so we are creating as creatures ourselves. And so we do things a little bit differently, but we take the pattern by what God did. And so when we look at the creation story, what we see is God creating the stuff and then organizing the stuff. And so, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void. And so he spends the next bit of time forming that which is formless. Okay? So he creates the waters, but then he separates the land and the water, right? He creates the darkness and light, but then he separates them and then creates the place for the light and the place for the darkness, the day and the night. And he's establishing this pattern. And if you notice, that pattern is not stopped in the 6 days. He's constantly ordering things that appear to be disordered. I find this very interesting, because God could have obviously created everything at once in its proper order, but he's establishing a pattern here, and it's a pattern for a reason. The deepness of that reason we could probably talk about that for a very long time, but our purpose is here is why we write. And so as we continue through the Bible, that pattern is reestablished. So by the time we get to Romans, that God has intended all things for our good, meaning all of everything that's been happening, all the chaos of our life. God is ordering it for a purpose in each and every event. And so when we get to art, that's the pattern of God's creation. And when we get to art, we find that our instinct is the same. And in all of art, I'm going beyond writing here. In all of the creative endeavors, what we're doing in one way or another is taking things that are formless, that are chaotic, and putting order to them. And so, music takes the randomness of sound and tone and puts it into melody and harmony and rhythm. Poetry, it takes all of the random, the words that we use, the phrases that we use, and puts them into lines and rhythm and rhyme. Painting, when we're talking about just the colors that we see outside are just, exceedingly incredible. And we can see all these colors and lights there. And again, the painter takes all of that and makes it into a form. And so we can keep going and we can keep going and we keep going. But when our purposes here is writing. And so specifically poetry, I've already mentioned. What about story? Even in the nonfiction story, we are taking the things that are chaotic and putting order to them and putting them into their place. And so when we write a biography of JFK, we spend more time on the Bay of Pigs than we do on the breakfast the day of the Bay of Pigs, But if you take all the moments of his life during that day, during that week, during that year, a small fraction of it is actually going to be spent on that event. But we are finding the story thread there. We're finding the order in the life, and we're laying it out in that order, and we're highlighting that thread, that the importance of it. We're highlighting that for the reader. That sort of main flow, that main, that gist of the story is so important. When we write a novel, when we write a story, it is not a series of just exciting events. But there's a force there. There's an arc there. There's an order, right? I mean, a lot of us wrote stories and novels as children, and a lot of times that overarching that overarching story lacked a lot, right? Because we had these images of what we found exciting, what we found interesting, and we would throw them in, and it just became this tangled mess of events that didn't have any sort of flow, any sort of thrust to it. I remember we had this amazing class when I was in 8th grade. We had this amazing class. I was in our English class, and we were very encouraged to write. And we spent a little bit of every class period writing. And it was fantastic. And Miss Mason, if you are listening, that class had a profound effect on me. And on Fridays we would share a lot of what we wrote, and it turned out that a lot of the people in class started writing adventures of the same superhero, and because we were writing just so episodically, it's just week to week, day to day, whatever came next. It was just one corny adventure. after another, and there was no point, and there was no theme, and there was nothing to make it cohesive. Well, it was a lot of fun, but it was a bad story, and it's because that chaos that was still there, that randomness, that formlessness that was still there. It was just chipping away at it. I wish I still had those stories. I don't. I've looked for them before. Not that I would show anyone, but they were a lot of fun. So the problem here comes in, and when we, because there's this trend now, and it's been going for a little bit of time. This trend now to buck that model, to buck the model of taking things that are formless and making a form out of them, or taking those things that are chaotic and putting them in order. There's a trend now to do the opposite, to break apart that which is ordered into disorder. And that is actually a move and an instinct that is in direct conflict with the model of creation that God has given us. And it doesn't work. It is not beautiful, and it's not meaningful. And I actually quoted it was in a random conversation too, but just today I quoted a line from Kurt Vonnegut, who was very famous for his postmodern structures of his stories, and there's a lot of Vonnegut I just really, really love. And the temptation is to look at the great authors who do some sort of deconstruction and some sort of postmodern structure and see, it can be meaningful. It can be, but if you actually read Vonnegut, there's form there. There's this very distinct form there. You go back to, and I'm gonna, oh goodness, I'm totally blanking. Well, now there's name, so I'm going to skip it. And of course, on the video, we're going to leave this in because that would involve editing. But in the audio podcast, we'll cut that out. But it's when these pioneers who write in a structure that is still has a form, that still has an order. But it tweaks things and it comes at things at a different angle. And a lot of times we misinterpret that as not having a form, and the imitators go off and they try to do things in a similar way, and it simply doesn't work. In the most famous, it's been a joke so long. It's been a cliche that, like modern artists, seems like, my children did the work of art, and there's a lot of truth in that. But, you take like the trends in art that started losing the traditional forms that we were used to in art, but doing different forms. So speaking directly about the Impressionists. Now, the Impressionists were seeming to lose the that form that art had held for so long. And it's not exactly true that that's what they were doing. They were aiming for something different. What they were aiming for was the form it took when light plays against objects. And that's what they were going for. And they did very well with that. But then later painters, misunderstood that approach and started tearing down at the forms. So you start drifting away, from order. And And you can trace it from there, from the Impressionist on downward, as paintings begin to lose their cohesion, lose anything that's holding them together. And so now what you get a lot of times is are paintings that are kind of oohed and awed over by all the right people, but don't actually impact anyone. And a lot of times we like them because we are told to, rather than actually liking them. With the advent of jazz and blues and backbeats and that sort of thing, early part of last century, a new form was taking hold, and a lot of people just kind of took that in the same direction, where we started losing the cohesion because they were misunderstanding what the jazz artists were doing as a rejection of form at all. And if you study jazz, it's anything but that. That's what we're finding when we come into a lot of, especially poetry today. Poetry is notorious for this. People, especially like really emotional writers who believe that the input of emotion into a work is what makes it valuable. We're going to get into that later. Kind of abandon the formalness, the formality of art, of poetry, because it hinders them. It kind of prevents them from expressing themselves in the way that they wanted to. And again we find that when you go back and you learn about like the impact that a lot of these poets of the past had, and the influence and the way people thought through these poems of all sorts, and the impact that poetry has today, which is almost none. There's a wide chasm there. And so the thing that we thought we were accomplishing here, we haven't accomplished. And so I think that coming back to the model, the model of creation that God has set forth for us, and seeing how that lines up with our own creative process, provides us a good model to go forward on, and a model that's been proven over the centuries as something that's been very effective and very influential. So we're going to get more into the nitty gritty of that as we go, of course. But that's the main idea today, that when we do art, when we are being sub-creators in a manner imitating the great creator himself, then we are creating, taking those things that are formless, taking those things that are chaotic, and finding form and creating an order there. And it's so, I really do appreciate you joining me today, and we will be back probably on the right day next week. Until then, never, never, never stop telling stories to one another.